Picture the most grueling athletic competition you can imagine. Now imagine that losing does not just mean going home disappointed. In some ancient versions of competitive sport, losing meant being sacrificed. The crowd was not cheering for their favorite team out of local pride. They were watching to see who would live and who would not. Ancient humans did not just play sports. Some of them played sports where the stakes were life and death, and the games themselves were often considered sacred rituals connecting the living world to the gods. Sports are not a modern invention. They are one of the oldest human behaviors we have ever found evidence for, and the story of where they came from and what they meant is far stranger and far more fascinating than anything happening in a modern stadium. Let us start with a question that surprises most people. How old is sport really? The oldest clear evidence of organized athletic competition dates back roughly 3,000 years to ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, where carvings and paintings show wrestling matches, archery competitions, swimming races, and a form of stick fighting. But wrestling almost certainly goes back much further than that. The basic mechanics of two humans grappling each other, testing strength and technique, require no equipment, no infrastructure, and no written rules. Researchers believe wrestling and foot racing were almost certainly practiced by prehistoric hunter-gatherer communities long before the first civilization built its first wall. When you are a young person in a group that depends on hunting and survival, testing your strength, speed, and endurance against other young people in a controlled competitive setting is not entertainment, it is training. It is practice for the real challenges the world is going to throw at you. Sport and survival were not separate things. They were the same thing, dressed differently. The ancient Egyptians took sport seriously enough to carve detailed illustrations of athletic competitions into the walls of temples and tombs. These carvings, some dating back nearly 4,000 years, show wrestlers using techniques that are still taught in competitive wrestling today: specific holds, specific throws, specific defensive positions. This tells researchers something remarkable. Wrestling technique was sophisticated enough 4,000 years ago that some of it has barely changed. They also show swimming competitions, boat racing on the Nile, javelin throwing, and a form of gymnastics. What is most striking about the Egyptian athletic depictions is the audience. These were not private practice sessions. These were public events with crowds watching, with referees present, with athletes wearing identifying marks to distinguish competitors. The social infrastructure of sport spectators, officials, rules was already fully formed in Egypt 4,000 years ago, but no ancient culture took sport to the extreme that the ancient Greeks did. The Olympic Games, which began in 776 BCE according to historical records, were not a casual athletic festival. They were a sacred religious event held in honor of Zeus at the sanctuary of Olympia, and they were important enough that warring Greek city-states would call a temporary truce to allow athletes and spectators to travel safely to compete and watch. Think about what that means. In a world of near-constant conflict between rival city-states, the Olympic Games were considered important enough to pause actual warfare. The athletes who competed were treated as near-divine figures. Winners received not money but an olive wreath, a symbol so culturally powerful that it could change a person's entire social standing for life. Victorious athletes returned home as heroes, were given free meals by their city for the rest of their lives, had poems written about them by famous poets, and in some cases had statues erected in their honor. The ancient Greek Olympic events themselves tell you a lot about what the culture valued. There was the stadium race, a straight sprint of roughly 200 meters. There was wrestling. There was the discus throw, the javelin throw, and the long jump. There was chariot racing, which was both the most prestigious event and the most dangerous, with crashes and deaths not being uncommon. And there was the Pankration, a full-contact fighting event that combined wrestling and striking with almost no rules. Biting and eye-gouging were the only things explicitly forbidden in some versions of the rules. Everything else, including chokeholds, joint locks, and striking on the ground, was permitted. The Pankration was essentially the ancient world's version of mixed martial arts, and some of the techniques documented by Greek athletes in their training are still recognizable to fighters training in gyms today. Now here is where the story takes its darkest and most extraordinary turn. While the Greeks were competing for olive wreaths and honor on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, a civilization was playing a sport with very different consequences. The Mesoamerican Ballgame, played by the Maya, the Aztecs, and civilizations going back at least 3,500 years, involved players using their hips, thighs, and arms to keep a heavy, solid rubber ball in the air and drive it toward a target, often a stone ring mounted high on a vertical wall. The ball itself, made of solid rubber, could weigh 4 kilograms. Getting hit by it at speed was genuinely dangerous. Players wore thick padding made of leather and cotton around their hips and knees, suggesting the impacts were severe enough to require protection. Broken bones, bruising, and injuries were a routine part of the game. But the part that captures everyone's attention is the sacrifice connection. Certain depictions at ancient Mesoamerican sites show that in at least some versions of the game played on at least some occasions, the losing team, or in some interpretations the winning team, faced ritual sacrifice following the match. The exact details are debated by researchers and varied between different cultures and time periods, but the connection between the ball game and religious ritual, including human sacrifice, is documented in the archaeological record. The rubber ball itself was a symbol of the sun. The game was not just competition, it was a cosmic drama, a reenactment of mythological events, a communication with forces beyond the human world. Playing it was an act of religious participation as much as athletic performance. The Romans inherited Greek athletic culture but transformed it into something more theatrical. The gladiatorial games are the most famous example, which were not technically sport in the competitive athletic sense, but shared the core DNA physical skill, risk, crowd spectatorship, and social ritual. But the Romans also held genuine athletic competitions modelled after the Greek Olympics, and they were passionate about chariot racing in the Circus Maximus, which at its peak could hold up to 250,000 spectators. The chariot racing factions identified by the colours blue, green, red, and white had fan bases so fanatical that riots between supporters of rival factions sometimes resulted in thousands of deaths. Ancient Rome had sports riots long before any modern football stadium existed. What all of this adds up to is something that fundamentally changes how we think about ancient people. Sport is not a luxury created by civilization and free time. It is a core human behavior that appears at every stage of human history, in every culture that has ever been studied, in one form or another. The specific rules change, the stakes change from olive wreaths to sacrifices to gold medals. The equipment changes from rubber balls to carbon fiber. The venues change from Egyptian temple courtyards to billion-dollar stadiums. But the fundamental drive to test human physical limits against other humans in a defined competitive setting, with an audience watching and with something meaningful at stake that has not changed in thousands of years. Ancient humans did not just play sports. They proved that the need to compete, to perform, and to push the body to its limits is not something society created. It is something we were born with.